5. The Gustav Gun. In order to successfully invade France and advance into Western Europe, Adolf Hitler needed to get past the 280-mile-long line of concrete structures known as the Maginot Line. Built in the 1930s, the Maginot Line ran along France's borders between Italy, Switzerland, Luxembourg, and Belgium. It was built to force the Nazi army to go around the line and through the incredibly dense Ardennes forest, which the French believed was an impossible feat. At first, the Germans didn't consider going around the line to be a viable option either, so instead, they set their sights on figuring out how to cross through the structures without suffering enormous casualties. One idea Hitler came up with was to create a railway gun that was capable of enough power to pierce through the fortifications. They'd call it the Gustav Gun. By the time his vision came to reality in 1941, France had already fallen, but the Nazis saw other useful applications for the weapon. Manufactured by German steelmaker and arms manufacturer Krupp AG, the Gustav gun was the largest gun to ever be used in combat, measuring over 4 stories high and 155 feet long. Also known as the Schwere Gustav or the Heavy Gustav, it weighed 1,350 tons with a 100-foot-long barrel, which measured 31 inches in diameter. There were 2 different types of ammo, including 10,000-pound explosive shells and 14,000-pound armor piercers, which could travel as far as 20 miles. To show his support and dedication to the war, Krupp gave the colossal weapon to the Nazis free of charge. The Germans debuted it in 1942 at the Siege of Sevastopol on the Crimean Peninsula, where they fought the Soviet Union forces for control of the Sevastopol port along the Black Sea. During this battle, the Gustav gun fired more than 300 shells. While it was capable of causing great damage, the gun had an impractical side and came with other disadvantages. For one, it was so huge that it was an incredibly easy target for overhead Allied bombers to aim at, and it weighed so much it could only be moved from place to place with a specialized railroad the Germans had to build at locations in advance. It took 4 days to assemble the gun's 5 parts, hours to calibrate it, and hundreds of men to even operate. And at a maximum, it could only fire 14 shells per day. In the meantime, railway guns were quickly becoming outdated and obsolete as newer weapons technology advanced rapidly throughout the conflict. Only 2 Gustav guns were ever built. The Nazis stopped using them within a year of the weapon's creation, and eventually scrapped them out of battle plans entirely. The Heavy Gustav came after decades of increasingly large railroad guns and centuries of weapons builders. It followed the age-old flawed philosophy that the bigger the weapon, the better. It was largely inspired by a German-built long-range artillery piece designed during World War I called the Paris Gun, which struck the famous French capital with 243-pound shells from over 75 miles away. And while the Paris Gun was inconvenient and difficult to maneuver, it was a wild success unlike the Gustav Gun, which proved simply too complicated, inconvenient, and old-fashioned for its time. 4. V3 Cannon. The Nazis planned to bombard London from below in an underground bunker complex 100 miles away in the Pas-de-Calais northern region of France. They started designing and building the weapon they planned to carry out the attack with, known as the Vergeltungswaffe 3, or V3 for short. Nicknamed Hitler's supergun or the England gun, it was meant to secure Germany's victory in the war. At the time, relentless Allied bombing campaigns were causing havoc all over Germany. In hopes of gaining an upper hand in the fight, Hitler called for the V3 to be the biggest gun ever constructed. Using forced slave labor, the Germans ordered the creation of the massive bunker that would house the infamous weapon. Then, construction on the V3 could finally begin. According to Hitler's plans, the gun would have 25 barrels, each measuring 427 feet long, and would be capable of hitting London with a bomb per minute. A sequence of charges along the barrels would propel projectiles forward, giving it the momentum needed to reach its intended targets. These charges would theoretically be powered by the buildup of gas found behind the projectile. Knowledge of the V3's exact details is very limited, since the Allies managed to destroy it in 1944 before it was finished being built, and because very few documents and photos of it have lasted into modern times. But it is known that the Nazis had trouble perfecting the weapon's design, particularly when it came to the projectiles. They struggled to come up with a shell that wouldn't spin wildly out of control as it reached supersonic speeds, and as far as modern researchers can tell, they never fixed this key issue. When the Allies saw that the Germans were investing massive resources into the bunker complex in France, they knew a major and potentially massive destructive project was underway. In their first attempt at destroying whatever it was, American forces tried to fly a remote-controlled heavy bomber packed with explosives into the Nazi site. The project took place as part of Project Aphrodite, or Project Anvil, on August 12, 1944. Pilot Joe Kennedy Jr., the older brother of future President John F. Kennedy, and his co-pilot Wilford Willey flew a B-24 Liberator with plans to set the course and bail out, while a second plane nearby took over their controls using a television transmission system. Unfortunately, the aircraft exploded, killing both Kennedy and Willey in the process. As it turned out, the site had already been destroyed 2 months earlier, bringing an end to the Germans' plans to build the biggest gun in history. On June 6, 1944, the British dropped 8 tall boy bombs on the weapon site and its surrounding tunnels, bunkers, and munition stashes. Everything was destroyed before the gun could even be test-fired. Whether or not the V3 gun would have been successful if it had been completed remains a debate. It was fraught with technical challenges and was an easy target, considering its massive size and fixed position. Even if the tallboy bombs hadn't destroyed the gun, the Allies would have likely demolished it at some point in the war. Do you think it would have worked out if it was completed? Tell us in the comments and hit subscribe while you're at it. 3. Grumlauf. As World War II entered into its final stages, it became increasingly clear to the Germans that the Allies had a very good chance at winning the war. In a seemingly desperate bid to turn the tide of conflict in their favor, the Germans began inventing secret weapons that were pretty impractical and ineffective. The Grumlauf was no exception to this. Its curved barrel was designed to fit onto an MP-44 rifle, allowing the shooter to aim at targets around corners and from inside armored vehicles without putting themselves in direct sight or harm's way. Experiments on these types of attachments meant to redirect bullets began in 1943. Several variations of the Grumlauf were created, including pieces with 30, 45, 60, and 90-degree angles. The version of the Grumlauf designed for use in tanks could be mounted vertically through portholes in the vehicle's ceiling. It was meant for shooting at enemy soldiers as they approached, and was capable of swiveling 360 degrees if necessary. The infantry model of the Grumlauf consisted of a 14-inch barrel, including a 4.5-inch straight section and a 5.5-inch curved portion. This was more popular than the tank iteration and included a large mirror to let soldiers see what they were aiming at. After the war, the US military ran tests on the weapon and discovered the bullets usually broke in half once they hit the curved portion of the barrel, or the cannelure as it was called. This made the gun essentially useless for anything other than firing at very close distances. There was also a tendency for the curved attachment to become distorted and worn out from the pressure of the bullets after getting fired multiple times. The 30-degree variation typically had to be replaced after shooting 300 rounds, while the 45-degree variant had a typical life expectancy of only 160 rounds. While the weapon was intended for use at close ranges and it was able to perform in this capacity on some level, its limited durability is a reminder of how the Grumlauf wasn't versatile enough to play a major role in helping the German war effort. 2. Panzer Maus tank. Designed by Ferdinand Porsche, the Panzerkampfwagen 8 Maus was designed based on Hitler's vision of an indestructible super tank. It was meant to be the biggest and most powerful tank ever created. Construction on the Maus began back in 1941. According to plans, it was set out to weigh 188 tons, dwarfing all of the Allied tanks being used at the time at 4 times their weight. It would be covered with hardened steel to make it practically impenetrable. Even the tank's tracks would be covered with steel to protect them during Allied firing. But all that metal weighed a lot, and the Maus tank was so heavy that it had many mobility issues. A conventional tank engine wouldn't support it. After testing various motors, engineers settled on a 1,200 horsepower diesel motor. But this only brought the tank's maximum speed up to just 12 miles per hour in the most flat and ideal terrain. The Maus also used a massive amount of fuel, so it couldn't go far before having to be refueled, and it required a sophisticated ventilation system to ensure the men inside could breathe safely and survive. In addition to being extremely complicated and slow, the tank was too heavy to cross most bridges in Europe or to even be ferried across rivers. It could be transported by rail, and it was capable of fording rivers while submerged below depths of up to 45 feet. If everything had gone to plan, The Maus would have been equipped with a powerful anti-aircraft gun and a smoke grenade launcher, which would have easily given it superior firepower over the Allied tanks. Hitler originally ordered 150 to be built, but the vehicle never made it past its prototype stage. The Germans blew up one of the two prototypes, while the other was captured by Soviets and remains displayed at the Kubinka Tank Museum in Moscow to this day. It's hard to gauge whether the Maus tank would have been effective in actual combat, but as journalist Brand Hetherington pointed out in a War History Online article, many World War II weapons were just an extension of their inventor's ego, and the Maus most likely fell into this category like so many others. While it was certainly big, tough, and better armed than most tanks of its time, it failed to achieve enough of its actual objectives to be worth the cost and resources needed to build it. 1. V2 rocket. In some aspects, the development of German V2 rockets marked one of the most impressive technological advancements during the Second World War. Measuring 46 feet tall and packed with a literal ton of explosives, it was the world's first long-range guided ballistic missile ever created. The Germans launched their first attack using the V2 against London on September 8, 1944, leaving a crater measuring 32 feet in diameter. 3 people were killed and 22 were injured in its wake. The highly destructive V2 rocket was capable of striking with little warning, laying siege to Paris, Antwerp, Norwich, and other major cities throughout Western Europe. After launching, it took only 5 minutes to reach its target, traveling at the edge of space along the way. By the time Germans developed and started using V2 rockets, they knew they were about to lose the war. This, along with other weapons the Nazis came up with during the conflict's last stages, was part of a last-ditch effort to secure Germany's victory. As the war continued to turn in the Allies' favor, Germans launched 1,300 V2 rockets at England and hundreds at Belgium and France. And while as many as 20,000 people lost their lives, it wasn't enough to give Germany the upper hand. The project came at an immense cost in terms of both money and lives. V2 rockets were built by slave workers, most of whom were taken from Nazi concentration camps. They were chosen for their ability to weld and other applicable skills, then carted off to an underground factory in central Germany near the Buchenwald concentration camp. The conditions at this factory were no less appalling than they were at other forced labor camps, with workers receiving little sleep, food, or proper hygiene necessary for life. They were also deprived of daylight and subject to brutal torture, with several eyewitnesses later reporting seeing fellow prisoners getting hanged from cranes over the assembly lines. The engineer who designed the V2 rocket, Werner von Braun, knew about the horrific suffering workers at the factory endured. He nevertheless went down in history as one of the first pioneers in the space age, instead of someone who chose to be complicit with the Nazis' brutal tendencies. The V2 killed many people, and this should never be discounted. But its level of destructiveness was relatively minor in comparison to the amount of money Germany spent on it. As the UK's Imperial War Museum's website points out, the number of explosives delivered by all V2 rockets combined was less than the amount dropped in a single RAF Bomber Command air raid. At the end of the day, the rocket simply wasn't worth all the effort that went into it. Thanks for watching. Which one of these failed Nazi weapons shocked you the most? Tell us in the comments below and don't forget to subscribe. Bye!